Now, while you're watching this video, please remember to like, subscribe to my channel, click the bell icon for notification of future videos, and share this video also. Thank you. Well, hello there guys, welcome back to my channel. I have another amazing study for you today. As you can see, the title of this study is The Truth About Long Hair and Head Covering. Trust me, this is going to be a study that you're definitely going to love, right? Please stick with me right through to the end. I know it's somewhat lengthy, even though I've had other videos that are lengthier, but stay tuned to the end because trust me, you're going to hear something which you perhaps have never heard before, right? Now, for this study that comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 11, in order to properly understand 1 Corinthians chapter 11, one must read 1 Corinthians chapter 10 at least from verse 23 to verse 33 and then go to chapter 11. Why should they do this? It is for the very reason that the scriptures are not in chapters, they are not sectionized in chapters. It is the translations of translators of the Bible. You understand, who actually does this in order to make the readers better understand. So because of this, when you're reading, you have to ensure that you do it in context and you identify if the chapter you're reading is actually a continuation of the previous chapter, right? You need to understand this. Why? Because the scriptures themselves, there are no chapters in it, right? They don't put them in chapters. So with that being said, I say this to say, because 1 Corinthians 11 is actually a continuation from 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And as I get down into it, you're going to see why. Even as, just as I also please men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, so that they may be saved. So Paul subjects himself to things so that he doesn't hurt other people's conscience, right? Because he's not about pleasing his own self, but pleasing people as well. That is why I say you must not give offense, neither to Jews nor Gentiles, nor the churches of God. This is what he wrote to the Corinthians, right? Then he says to them, be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. So just as how Paul doesn't please himself, he's telling them the same thing, right? And Paul adapt that from Christ because he says he's an imitator of Christ. Christ didn't please himself either. So he's telling them to do the same thing. Verse 2, now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. This is NASB, you know. The KJV says ordinances. But of course, if you look in the Greek, that can be translated as traditions. Right? Yeah, if you look in the Greek, it comes from the Greek word paradosis. And it is translated 12 times in the KJV as tradition. But once and only once is it translated in the KJV as ordinance. You get that? And this is why you can't stick to KJV alone, you know. 12 times it's translated as tradition, and one and only one time it is translated as ordinance here. Which would you say is a better rendering of the text? Out of consistency, I would say tradition, right? And this is why more modern translation, such as the NASB and the ESV, both of them together, and an amplified version renders it as traditions. And this is important for you to note, you know, because this particular chapter, what many persons miss, it is all centered on tradition and not law. This is a very, 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 very important point for you to note. But even before, so now let me repeat the verse, you know. Now I praise you. Sorry guys. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions, just as I delivered them to you. I'm going to get back to this verse, but I'm going to skip and go to verse 16. Remember, we are doing it from verse 1 to verse 19. But let's look at verse 16. And then I go back. I'll eventually get back to verse 16, you know. But I want to show you something. Verse 16 in the KJV says, but if any man seem to be contentious, We have no such custom, neither the churches of God. So for the KJV only is, your own KJV is telling you that everything that you read from verse 1, right up until verse 16, it is a custom, not a law. Custom and law is two complete different things. And this is why I say to you that in verse 2, in verse 2 of 1 Corinthians 11, the proper rendering of the text is tradition. Tradition and custom is basically one and the same thing. Right? So that is why tradition is a better rendering, because your own KJV tell you that it's a custom, it's not a law. Now let's look in the Greek word for custom. What does it mean in the Greek? Well, it's only used 2 times. It's something that is done habitually, so it's a custom, right? But it's not a law. Custom and law is 2 different things, you know, right? So with that being said, let us skip back now to go to verse 3 now. Having understanding that Paul is talking about traditions and customs, let's go to verse 3, right? And again, you know, remember I'm using different translation. Let me use the ESV, English Standard Version. And you'll understand why I use the English Standard Version, because it does some real good translation in this. I'll still use the KJV for the KJV only is, but I'll use more the ESV says. I'll use more the ESV should say and other translation. The ESV says, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Bingo. You don't see wife mentioned in the text, you know, in 1 Corinthians 11, you know. And this is why persons who use the KJV actually get this this teaching very, very, very incorrect. They mess up completely in their interpretation of this. Is wife a better translation than woman mentioned in the text? Yes, and here's why. I have to do this enough for KJV only who is going to reject this. The KJV says, I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ. And the head of the woman, notice it didn't say the head of every woman, you know. Right? That is important for you to know, because I am not the head of every woman. No man in this world is the head of every woman. Right? My boss is a woman, and I am not the head of her. If I dare try to tell her anything, I'll get myself fired. I'm not the head of her. She doesn't owe me any obligation. So obviously, the better rendering of the text is wife there. And you notice their own KJV deliberately says the head of the woman. It never says every woman. So definitely it's one woman, and that has to be the wife. But it says the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man or the husband then. Right? The head of, that is why the ESV said the head of a wife is her husband. So the text in the KJV that says woman and man, the proper rendering is wife and husband. That is what Paul is dealing with here. Relations to wife and husband, and you're going to see why. If you look in the Greek word for man mentioned in the text is, it's come from a word an. I can't pronounce it right, but I'll put the spelling. It comes from the word anir. I don't know if I pronounce it right. Anir. And it can be translated as, it says the meaning of it is a man, properly as an individual male, fellow husband. So it can be translated as husband, sir, and fellow, and man too. So not just man alone. So it can be translated as husband. And the same thing for woman in the text. It comes from a word guni, and it says a woman, specifically a wife. So it can be translated as a wife or a woman. So therefore, those who are translating this text has to look at the context to determine whether woman or wife is the better rendering based on context. Likewise, whether man or husband is the better rendering of the text. You have to determine by the context. And the context of verse 3 would tell you that the better rendering is obviously husband and wife. Why? Because it says, I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man. You never said the head of every woman, you know. Right. But it said the head of the woman is the man. So definitely it's just one man and one woman. The head of the wife is the husband. God never placed man as head over every woman. He just placed the husband over the wife. So that is why the ESV puts it, translate it better. So with that being said, that's irrefutable. Right? With that being said, let me continue on the ESV. Verse 4. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Right? But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. Right? So, first and foremost, if you're not a wife, then this doesn't go for you, none at all. But you see, when you look into the church, most time you see even single women putting on head covering as if this applies to them. And it doesn't, because you're not married. Yet it doesn't, because you're not married. It is only applicable to women who are married, to wives. You understand? It's only applicable to them, because the head covering symbolizes that you have authority over your head. And remember now, you know, according to verse 3, you know, it's not every man have authority over you, woman, who is listening to this. Not every man have authority over you. It's only your husband who has authority over you. So this can't go for you unless you are married. So the ESV is a better rendering. Every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. And I'm going to point out something else to you. Remember when I went to verse 16 and tell you, we talk about we have no such custom, neither the churches of God, or another translation would say neither God's other churches. It is in the context of church. Head covering is in the context of church, right? So that means to say that if you're here and you're not at church, you know, you don't have to have on the thing on your head once you're praying or you prophesy, only when it's in the church, and it's only if you're a wife. Now let's go to verse 6. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. And next translation, NASB, will say she should cut off her hair, then, so to speak. But since it is disgraceful, or the NASB say, but if it is disgraceful, right? If it is disgraceful, I would say the NASB right there is better, right? If it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair, or a woman to cut off her hair or shave her head, then let her cover her head, right? Verse 7, for a man ought not to cover his head, right? Since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman or the wife is the glory of the man, right? The woman is the glory of the man. So then verse 8 says, for man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. So the KJV says, for this cause ought the woman to have power. It means authority on her head, because of the angels. So the head covering, it is a symbol of authority, right? That you're married and you're subject to your husband. It's a way to acknowledge your husband's authority over you, right? Because woman came from man and not the other way around, right? A woman was made for man. Then in verse 11 now it says, nevertheless in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman in the Lord. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Right? Judge for yourself, verse 13. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Then it says, verse 14, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him. I'm going to go to the Amplified Version now. The Amplified Version says, does not the native sense of propriety, open and close bracket, experience, common sense, reason, itself teach you that for a man to wear long hair is a dishonor, humiliating and degrading to him? So here's why I switched to the Amplified Version. In the Greek, the word for in verse 14 in the Greek, when it said nature, it can also, in the Greek, it actually mean natural production or lineage. It can also mean figuratively native disposition, right? So figuratively, it can mean figuratively native disposition. And when you're talking about native, you're talking about the surrounding, the culture, and so forth, right? So it can be figuratively, it can mean native. So this is why the Amplified Version says, does not the native sense of propriety itself teach you that for a man to wear long hair is that it is a dishonor to him? Remember early in the text, verse 2, Paul talks about the traditions that he has given them, which I mentioned earlier already, right? All of this has to do with tradition. It is the same, in 1 Corinthians 10, right? When Paul said, well, if you know that the thing is offered to idol, don't eat it for the person's conscience sake, right? Because they do it for idol in that culture and so forth, for idol worship, so don't do it for his sake. It is the same thing being said here in verse 14, that for because of the culture, the native sense, because of nativity, right? It is shameful. The culture there tell you that it is shameful, right, for a man to have long hair. That is what Paul is saying here. But verse 15, if a woman has long hair, it is her ornament and glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. That is Amplified, that I'm still on. So the nature, the culture tells them that it is shameful for man to wear long hair, right? But for the woman, it is her glory. That is what the culture say, So just as what he said in chapter 10, don't eat it if you know it's offered to idol. Not that it's wrong, but for the person's sake. It is the same thing here in 1 Corinthians 11, where it's talking about the culture. It says, culture says the long hair are not proper, right? But it's proper for women. It's her glory. So to suit the culture, women, grow your hair. To suit the culture, men, don't grow your hair, because it looks weird. It looks bad in the culture. Don't please yourself alone. That's what he said in 1 Corinthians 10. You know it is going to bother the conscience. How are you going to win them over? You understand, to Christ? Just as how Paul says, I am become all things to all men. To Jew I become a Jew. To Gentile I become a Gentile, to win all of them. So Paul compromises a lot of time, being skillful to bring them to Christ. So that is what he's saying to them in that culture. Right? And for Gina Jennings, who will basically say that I'm a false teacher, if one of his followers come across this, I'm going to challenge you to think critically. Under the Mosaic law, Samson was told to grow his hair. No razor was supposed to come on his head. John the Baptist, he was subjected to the very same thing as well. If it is that nature, according to KJV, tells you that it's a shame for men to grow their hair, what was it about the nature back then that made it okay? I mean, as far as I know, when Jesus come and die on the cross, yeah, we know things change and so forth, but I don't see anywhere in the Bible where it tells you that the cross causes nature to change, I don't see anywhere in the Bible where the cross causes nature to change. The same nature then is the same nature now. I didn't know that Jesus' death on the cross affected the atmosphere, because nature has to do with the atmosphere, and so forth, all of that is nature, all of that is nature. And I didn't know that when Jesus died on the cross, the atmosphere and everything changed? No, I don't know about that. I never read that in the Bible. And this is why the Amplified Version renders the text better by saying if the native disposition, because it is talking about culture. This is why in verse 2, where the text in KJV says ordinance, and I show you that tradition is a better rendering of the text, right? Because Paul is dealing with traditions and so forth of that day and age, right? It was all on tradition. And let me continue now. Know that I made that point, and let me continue now. Let me continue. Verse 16. If one is inclined to be contentious, right? We have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. NLT said, but if anyone wants to argue about this, I simply say that we have no other custom than this, and neither do God's other churches. Right? The Amplified said, now if anyone is disposed to be argumentative and contentious about this, we hold to and recognize no other custom in worship than this, nor do the churches of God generally. So this is the only custom that they are there to. Verse 17. But in following instructions, I'm on the ESV now. But in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part. For there must be factions among you, in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. So you see what's happening here? Big divisions and so forth, is happening where all these things is concerned, And this is why Paul took the time out to tell you every single thing, deal with this subject in detail. So what did we learn from this? One, if you're once you're not married as a woman, none of this is applicable to you. You understand the whole head covering thing? It's not applicable to you unless you're married. Two, right? It is a custom or tradition. So even if you're married and so forth, you're a wife, you don't have to adhere to this because it is a tradition. It is a tradition, you understand? In those days and so forth, it is a tradition. And we have been far removed from that tradition. It's a custom. It's not a law. Custom and law is different. Because of the culture in that day, that is why they did that, because of the culture. We have been far removed from that. But if you're not convicted, right, as a woman and you're married and you want to put on your head covering, then fine. But don't be too hard pressed on this. You understand? Because for one, if this was something that is a law, you don't wonder in yourself why it's only mentioned once in the Bible. Which subject in the Bible do you ever find it only talk about once? Didn't the Bible say 2 or 3 witnesses a thing shall be established? Where's the other witness to establish this doctrine? There is no other witness. This only appears one time in the Bible. No other time at all. And the Bible says you need 2 witnesses to establish it. It's not a law. It's not a law. You don't have to abide by it. It's simply a custom, and that is why Paul never spent much time on it. But if you're not convicted about it, if you're married and you want to wear it, then fine. But if you're not married, it doesn't apply to you. You understand? What does this say about the hair now? If a woman wants to shave her hair, remember now, I pointed out, according to native, which the Amplified Version renders it according to native disposition. It is a shame if the woman shave her hair. That is according to the culture. The hair is given her for a covering according to the culture and so forth. That was how they saw it, right? But we are not under that culture. Culture and law is different thing. We have been far removed from those traditions, right? So you don't, if you feel like you want to cut your hair as a woman, it's not a law. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. It's a custom. So if you feel like you want to cut your hair, then it's fine. Because if you live in some countries, like Africa and some of those hot places, most of them, they wear their hair long. You want to know why? It's very hard to wear long hair in those hot places and so forth. And trust me, it can affect you, health-wise, It can affect you, right? The heat and so it generate and so forth. It's better for you to actually wear short hair in those places because of the heat, right? Now, what else should I point out? For the men, wearing your long hair, it's not a sin. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. That chapter, it's a custom. I showed it to you, right? And if it was a shame, if it wasn't a custom, and it's naturally a shame. Use your common sense and critical thinking skills now. Why would it not be a shame for Samsung and not be a shame for John the Baptist to not cut his hair and to wear his hair long and yet still be a shame for you? How is it that it wasn't shameful then and it's shameful now? Let me try to bring out something that is shameful. Let me bring out something that is shameful and disgusting. Alright, in the Old Testament, right? It's a sin to have sex with animal. And trust me, it's very shameful and disgraceful. Do you think that in the New Testament it would no longer be disgraceful? Of course it would. How can something be not be shameful in one time period and now become shameful in the next time period? Does that even make any sense to you? It makes no sense whatsoever. So if you're a man and you want to grow your hair, I have no qualms with you about it. If a man wants to grow his hair, I have no problem with that. There is no law against it. 1 Corinthians 11 is not saying a man cannot grow his hair. It is not saying that he cannot grow his hair. Right? And where the head covering for a man is concerned, right? Even that too. Where it say if it's a shame for the man to cover his head, that's custom too. Let me see if I can get back to the text and show you. Let me see if I can get back to the text. Let me see if I can get back to the text. Just give me a minute, guys. No, yeah, sorry. So where the man is concerned now, and the head covering. If I say something wrong now, I'm going to fix it up. Where the man is concerned, and head covering, This now is not talking husband, This is talking man. Right? Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying, disgrace his head. So that means that once you're praying, or you're prophesying, right? You shouldn't have something on your head. It's not talking here now, So that means that you mustn't wear a cap and so forth. Once you're praying or you're prophesying, right? Now, this has to do when you're in church now, Right? Once you're in church. Because this has to do with this has to do with the church, right? Once you're in church, you're praying or you're prophesying, you shouldn't wear a cap, right? When you're in church. That means that outside a church, it's okay for you to do so if you want to. Once you're not in the church, you can do that. Because verse 16 lets them know that it's a custom of the church, right? Everything is tradition and customs of the church. Worship, acts of worship, how do they worship and so forth in the church. So once you're not in the church, it's okay for you to wear a cap if you want to on your head, right? So you notice in some of my videos I have on cap and so forth. There's no sin in that. I'm not at church. And besides, a couple weeks ago I needed to shave and to go on camera. There's no way I could put be on it sometime without having on a cap. So, yeah, I'm ending this study now. I do hope that you are edified by it. Now, stay tuned next week where we'll be talking about some more interesting topics. Right? On Fridays, I have some more things for you. Right? Bye-bye now.